Hello, everyone, and welcome to Leading in a New Reality. My name is Stephen Jones. I am a board member of Lead San Diego and CEO of Jones. I'm filling in today for Elizabeth Fitzsimons, Vice President of Leadership and Engagement at Lead San Diego, an affiliate of the San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce. At Lead, we are focused on connecting, educating, and empowering leaders for positive change. This program is one of many offerings at Lead, which include professional and leadership development, programming, board matching, and working with local nonprofits to maximize their effectiveness in the community. This series is produced in partnership with my company, Jones. Our mission is to develop leaders and organizational systems that counter oppression through diversity, inclusion, and organizational excellence. This is a webinar that's meant to help you understand what's happening in our ever-changing world and connect you with sources of inspiration and empowerment, and most importantly, to equip you with tools to help you lead your teams, lead your organizations, lead yourself, and lead your family. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed by ABC 10 News, a longtime partner of Lead San Diego, and it's being live streamed on their Facebook page. Please use the Q&A buttons at the bottom of your screen to send us questions for our panelists. We'll take questions from our viewers and who are also on Facebook as well. Lead Program Manager Kim Nguyen is at the controls. Hey, Kim. She's there. And we'll try to get to as many questions as possible as we spend our time together. Today's topic is about building inclusion and anti-racism as a core part of this new normal that we are being challenged to create. As we begin to develop reopening plans for businesses and schools, the topic will focus on how do we ensure diverse voices that reflect our communities are included? How do we reevaluate our systems to ensure that we're not institutionalizing racism? And we're going to just take a deep dive into that. Joining us today to take that deep dive are three leaders who can help us answer that question. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lida Rafia. How are you, Dr. Rafia?
Great, thank you.
Excellent. Dr. Rafia is the Dean of Student Success and Equity at Grossmont College. Passionate about people, teams, and organizations, Dr. Rafia creates cultural transformation through an equity and inclusion lens. Dr. Rafia has extensive experience leading strategic change in the community, colleges, and various leadership capacities that have included program and curricular design, training and facilitation, strategic planning, and organizational development. As Dean of Student Success and Equity, she works collaboratively to build consensus across constituency groups to advance student success and foster an inclusive environment to positively impact policies, practices, and cultures. Dr. Rafia has earned her master's degree in education leadership and policy from Portland State University and her PhD in education with an emphasis in community college leadership from Oregon State University. Welcome, Dr. Rafia.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Excellent. Next, I'll introduce Dr. Damian Robinson. How you doing, Dr. Robinson?
Doing well. How are you?
Excellent. Doing very well. Dr. Robinson is a consultant at Jones, a senior consultant, and a strategic leader and education advocate who has devoted his life's work to creating pathways to quality degrees and career development for underrepresented students. Over the last 3 weeks, Dr. Rafia has been a part of a team that's engaged over Dr. Robinson has been a part of a team that has engaged over 25,000 leaders across the country in this conversation around creating our new normal that has inclusion at its core. He has more than 12 years of education and leadership experience and has served a diverse array of students and leaders across K through 12 to college pipeline, as well as across corporations around the country. Dr. Robinson holds a BS in psychology from Howard University. I'm sorry, the Howard University.
Thank you.
And an MA in counseling from San Diego State University, and a doctorate in education, educational leadership from San Francisco State University. Welcome, Dr. Robinson.
Thank you.
Excellent. And rounding out our panel is Mr. Andrew Simmerman. How are you, Andrew?
Oh, doing well.
Excellent, excellent. Andrew is the Director of Community and Donor Relations at KIPP SoCal Public Schools. Andrew is a nonprofit leader, educator, entrepreneur, and communications professional. Mr. Zimmerman, prior to joining KIPP SoCal, he was president of business development for Rise San Diego. I just love the work that's being done at Rise, Andrew. Look forward to hearing some about some of that work as well. Rise is dedicated to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion at workplaces and in educational institutions and communities. Mr. Zimmerman also ran programs for the Jacob Institute at the University of San Diego and was head of partnerships for Teach for America San Diego. Andrew earned his bachelor's in advertising from Pepperdine University, his master's in education from CUNY Lehman College, and additionally, he's a 2015 graduate of LEED's Impact Program, part of the LEED family, and was part of the inaugural cohort of the RISE San Diego Urban Leadership Fellows Program. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Awesome, awesome. Well, let's just jump right in. So the first question that we'll ask you all to talk about is the idea of what does building inclusion and anti-racism as a core part of our new normal mean to you? Dr. Rafia, why don't we start off with you?
Sure. Well, I'd like to just start off by how we define these terms and also understanding that anti-racism is an active process. It's a verb, it's action-oriented. And when we think about inclusion, we also couple that normally with diversity. So, you know, a person may bring diversity to a team, but diversity only exists in relationship to others. And that's really important to note. And that in that active process, we need to critically examine the makeup of our organizations and our employees and thinking about who are they, what are their lived experiences and perspectives, and who are those that we're missing at the tables. And then inclusion in that still active process is making sure that your organization is contributing to everyone, particularly our Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color, also considering the intersectionalities of identity, race identity, gender identity, ethnic identity, so that the inclusion part is really feeling valued, feeling a sense of belonging, that everyone can contribute to the larger organizational goals and are recognized. So when we think about building an anti-racist institution or culture, it's really about examining and questioning for whom are you creating a more inclusive environment? What systemic barriers exist that may limit or impede on any of the efforts that you're taking? How do our practices, our language, our culture contribute to perpetuating these racist organization? And in higher education, you know, we think about this as how it's contributing to our low and inequitable student success outcomes. And then thinking about individually how we try to identify touch points where individual action, so those decision making comes into play. We know that we all have bias, and how can we become more aware of those biases when we make whether that's individual, in the department, thinking about those practices and policies. And, thinking about, you can't create a new culture unless you already have an existing understanding of the attitudes, values, and behaviors that make up that model.
Got it.
And reshaping culture, in this case, my frame of reference, it's college culture in systems and produces, and those procedures are really necessary to create an anti-racist organization. So looking at budget influence, planning, decision-making, those are all things to think about to ensure accountability.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rafia. Now, Andrew, I know you've conducted many anti-racist or anti-racism training. Tell us a little bit about kind of what that entails, and what are some of the obstacles and successes that you've seen.
Yeah. Well, I think, in our society, we've created the sort of false dichotomy of, racist and not racist. And that allows folks to say, well, I'm not racist. I don't say these racist things. I don't do these racist things. I don't have these racist beliefs. I'm a good person. I'm not racist. I treat everyone the same. And the problem with that is when you're passively just not racist, you are allowing those racist systems and structures to be perpetuated. And for those of us in the dominant group, there's a benefit to that. And so anti-racism, as Dr. Rafia had pointed out, it's actionable. You have to take actions, and you have to actively fight against those systems and structures. So although you may be not racist, that's great. How are we fighting against those systems and structures that are? And it doesn't have to be, going to work for a nonprofit or running for public office. It can be as simple as taking a look at your church congregation. And if you have a diverse congregation, but the leadership isn't diverse, is there an opportunity to advocate, to say that, hey, we should have more voices that are more representative of our church, church congregation. And so fighting for some of those things. I also think about, for me, kind of this identity work and anti-racism work. For me, I think about the kindergarten through PhD continuum, where this work is a learning process. And so I was 22 years old, teaching in the South Bronx, mostly recent immigrants. And I was a kindergartner when it came to identity work, because I belonged to so many of the dominant groups, white, male, straight, affluent, able-bodied, English-speaking, that I had so many blind spots that when, I was 22 years old and I had the belief that, I'm not racist, I don't see color, I treat everyone the same. My students saw nothing but color every single day. They were further along the lines of that continuum because of their lived experience. So if I want to be an effective teacher, I need to do that work in my own life. And so for me, just tangibly, I think of three things in building towards that anti-racism shift. And these are kind of the prerequisites. I think one is there's identity work that needs to take place that Dr. Rafia had pointed out. And not just race, not just gender, but things like the fact that I'm the middle child of a middle child of a middle child. And that shows up in my work relationships and my personal relationships. So doing identity work allows you to deconstruct those things. And then particularly, again, if you're in the dominant groups, if you're a white person, have you walked into a space where you're the only white person in that space? Have you experienced that? Most of my Black friends, most of my gay friends, most of my female friends have had those sorts of experiences that I hadn't had. So you need to do some identity work. The second thing is you need to commit to the long term. This doesn't happen overnight. As brilliant as the Jones Consulting team is, if I'm an organization and I bring you in for a 2-hour implicit bias training, that's not going to move the needle. I need to commit to the long-term change, the real deep work that takes place, and commit to that. And then third, we need to normalize dominant discomfort. That discomfort that comes in this space with folks in dominant groups, it's because it's the first time we've felt that. And that discomfort is felt by a person of color growing up. They have experience after experience, and it's painful. And for us to enter into these conversations, we need to know that that's part of the growth process, that we're going to say something we really don't mean, and hurt someone in a way we didn't mean to, but what can we learn from that? How can we grow so we don't do that again, that we can call it out when we see it in other ways? And so we need to normalize that.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. Really appreciate that. Dr. Robinson, I know you're doing a lot of work supporting leaders in moving forward, what Andrew spoke about, what Dr. Rafia spoke about. What do you see as some of the challenges and obstacles that leaders are facing as they work to do that identity work, that systems work? Where do you see leaders getting stuck?
Thank you for asking that question, Dr. Jones. One of the challenges that I'm really seeing leaders grapple with is finding the right balance between immediate action versus long-term systemic change. You know, prior to COVID-19, we oftentimes would say it takes 3 to 5 years to shift organizational culture in an inclusive culture, right? And then anywhere from 5 to 10 years. And then what we saw with COVID-19 was that the country essentially turned on a dime in order to keep everyone safe. And so what happened was there was a mindset shift where people began to see that it's actually possible for us to shift the way that we do things if it is important enough. And it makes me think back to how many companies had been telling employees for the longest time, it is impossible for you to do your job from home. And then they were forced to do their jobs from home and figured out that it worked, right? And so oftentimes when I'm having conversations with leaders, they want to demonstrate to their employee base that they're doing something that's meaningful, but they're also having to grapple with wanting to do it right so that it has long-term effect and long-term change, if that makes sense, right? And what I'm hearing is that oftentimes I'm finding that companies will make an immediate gesture, like make a donation to maybe like Black Lives Matter movement or some community organization to say, hey, we want everyone to know that we're on board. But part of the feedback that they're grappling with that oftentimes is coming from the employees is that when are we going to begin to examine hiring practices that have had impacts on people of color being able to move up the ladder, right? When are we going to be able to have conversations about promotional practices, right? And how to grapple with that and being able to do it in a way where the employees feel that there is some movement, but also knowing that we can't move too fast because this is a long-term solution that we need in order to have that real systemic change. And then the other one that is really, really important to note, right, is that leaders and organizations are having a difficult time identifying practices and processes that don't necessarily have racist overtures, but have a significant impact on Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color. For example, I was working with an organization and they have, I would say the diversity is around 15%. And because of COVID-19, they had to lay off a significant number of people. And what they found later on was that 40% of the people who were laid off were people of color. And there wasn't an intentionality about laying off people of color, but the way that the system had been set up, those were the people who were let go first. And so being able to examine those things that are not glaring in your face, but are having impacts on people of color, those are two major obstacles that I'm working with leaders on in terms of trying to figure out what's going on in this space.
Thank you. Excellent. Excellent. And so thank you for that, Dr. Robinson. And Andrew, you talked about, was it dominant group discomfort?
Dominant discomfort.
Dominant discomfort. So I want to ask all of you, as we think about kind of creating this new normal, my question is, what makes this so hard? Like what do you find? I mean, you know, in theory, everybody would say we want everybody to do their best. In theory, everyone would say we want to hire the most qualified people. In theory, what makes this conversation around anti-racism, around diversity, around equity, why is it so difficult?
If I can just start, you know, one of the things that it reminds me of is because we've been, it's been learned. We've learned to not talk about it. It's something that we don't talk about. There are so many emotions that are tied to this: the feeling of shame, the feeling of guilt, the pain, the anger, tired, racial battle fatigue. Like, all of these things are real, and when we don't talk about it, it's suppressing. And not understanding the larger issue that this is 400 years in the making. This is a foundation. We have not been taught this in schools. So, you know, there's a reason. There's a reason why we haven't been taught. And so a lot of it is unlearning, and that's painful. Unlearning what you've been taught. I mean, even children's lullabies are racist. You know, some of Disney movies, if you look at them as an adult, you're like, wow, you know, I'm you know, rediscovering them through my child's lens, you know, now. So these things are really hard. And I think that as leaders, you know, going to your point about why is this so hard, is it's fear of not doing it correctly. It's fear, I think it's failure, like feeling that you might offend somebody or hurt somebody's feelings, or as a leader you should know, or as a leader you're not leaning in and asking for help, or even going to your Black employees at this time and just checking in on them, humanizing the experience. Our organizations are not places where we share emotions. It's not a place where we can be vulnerable. They're not organized in a way to be real. And I think that's why it's so hard, and how we have to, this transformation requires us to rethink around how we do our daily business and how we interact with each other, and allow for people to connect with each other on a human level.
Got it. So the new normal is really disruptive to what we've been taught as normal. Is that
Absolutely.
fair? Yeah. Very good.
And,
Dr. Robinson, go ahead, Andrew.
Well, just to add on that, I think, you know, that's like, we all have our egos, and our egos will kind of block our full vision. And our ego is a storyteller, and we create narratives of the world, of who we are. And so in a lot of ways, it's trying to, you know, set this ego down so that I can listen to you, to understand, not to argue, not to defend my point, not to persuade you. And so in a lot of ways, that's fearful, because that's the protector. Now I'm putting my armor down and I'm real with you. What's going to come out, like Dr. Rafia said, what's going to come out that might hurt someone, might offend someone, that I'm not intending to do. And then as a leader, when you're making decisions, the fear of what that means organizationally, or all of the other complex lines of having a board, having shareholders, having your clients or your customer base, and having your staff. And so the thing is, what we know to be true is there is real economic costs and really benefit to doing this right, but it's fear in the short term. And one more thing that is just so critical to acknowledge is there's healing that needs to take place. And we have very real wounds that exist individually, personally, and then also in our country. And so we do have to go back to how our country started, to what happened with indigenous people. We do have to go back to slavery. And we don't have to go back that far. We also just had Congressman John Lewis, who passed away, who was spit on by people who are still living today. And so this was not that long ago. And even if it was, these are wounds left unhealed, and they're going to show up. If we do not acknowledge, that's the first thing you do with a wound, is you have to air it out. You have to see it. And now how do we heal it?
Yeah, it's so powerful. I think about, to your point around the congressman, and him being one of the freedom riders. and I would always think about the idea of the individuals who were sitting at the tables, right, to get served on. And oftentimes our focus was on the people who were spitting and pushing and punching and, you know, saying hateful things in the restaurant. But we weren't really taught to focus on the people who were in the restaurant sitting down, not saying anything to those people who were doing the spitting and the punching. And so I think about that around your point earlier, Andrew, around not being a racist. I would imagine that there would be many people in that restaurant who would say, I'm not a racist, as they said nothing as racism occurred right next to them. And so I think it's just real powerful. Dr. Robinson, we're also seeing people of color and Black people speaking up more and telling stories that they have been silenced or felt silent about, or that was the only option. What are you seeing in terms of the voice of people of color and Black people specifically speaking up during this time as part of the new normal?
Absolutely, thank you. So part of what I'm saying is the idea of invisibility, right? And how so many Black people have been saying that I have intentionally made myself invisible so that I can just survive the day at work, right? And then the consequences that come and the side effects that come with that invisibility. And in fact, I was having a conversation with an individual, and this individual said that there was an extreme sadness that came over her after George Floyd had happened, and no one asked her about how she was doing. And the individual said, have I done such a good job hiding my Blackness that they didn't even see me here, right? And so part of what I'm hearing from people now is the burden and the side effects of being invisible in the workplace. Part of that being not wanting to be perceived as the angry Black person, not wanting to be perceived as a person that's just a crybaby. And in a very real way, I need to make money so that I can provide for my family. So there is a survival anxiety that people are having conversations about now that are linked to the way that they show up in the workspace. Right? And then the other part that I'm really hearing from people is really this impact of being in a space where you are looked over or you are not given opportunities of your white counterparts who are less qualified. And let me be specific. There was an individual who spoke to me and said, I've been in this position for 6 years. I'm way more qualified than the white counterparts who I have trained, and I've seen them shoot up the leadership pipeline. I then attempted to get another job somewhere else. And the question came up, why have you been in this position for so long? So what happens is that it wasn't about the skills that she demonstrated on her resume. There was a judgment about this individual because of the color of their skin, that they're probably a difficult person if they have all of these skills, yet they have not moved within their organization, right? And so now hearing the stories and the patterns and the impact that it's having on people, not just within organizations, but even in the way they're able to move in their personal lives outside of work, which is very, very impactful for us to hear.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you. Andrew, I'm hearing a number of individuals who are white say, I don't know what to say right now. I don't want to say the wrong thing. And then right next to that, I'm hearing people say, do I even have a right to have a voice right now? And then we're hearing some others who are saying the cost of getting it wrong right now is pretty high, right? What do you say to those individuals who are part of the white community who are struggling to figure out how they become or function as a part of the solution to creating anti-racism and inclusion as part of our new normal?
No, thank you for that question. There could be a whole, separate conversation, I think, just on this topic. A couple things that come up for me is I think the cost of doing nothing is far greater. So, there is a cost of doing it wrong, and like you should, bring in experts, to really move forward in the right direction. So I'm not saying just go out and have these conversations, facilitate them amongst yourselves, and just go for it. What is critical, what I have found, again, belonging to all the dominant groups that I belong to, is I've needed to listen to understand. I've needed to gain new perspectives. And so it really starts there. The challenge is oftentimes what that could mean is, as a white person, we say, well, I want to bring in the Black person I know and ask them questions. Now that's putting the burden on them to educate us about their trauma and pain that we have put on them.
Yeah.
And so that furthers that. So there is so much literature available out there that has blueprints, that has information and understanding. Go read them. There are hip hop albums that you can listen to get information. And who are your friend groups? We create these echo chambers where I talk to people who look like me, sound like me, and think like me. And so of course that's my perception of the world. Yeah. And yeah, maybe I have a Black friend at church, but do they feel like they need to be like us in our dominant group to fit in? So they make me feel safe and comfortable. Have I ever actually asked them, you know, their story, their experience, how they feel in the same places we go? Yeah. If they're your friend, that's a little different to ask some of those questions, because to Dr. Robinson's point, it's seen the people around you valuing the folks around you. And so I really think that there is also this fear mechanism of, you know, we take things so personally. And so again, that ego defense. So initially with white privilege, what do you mean white privilege? I worked hard. I worked extremely hard. I had a really tough childhood. And yes, that's true. This isn't about you is the thing. How can we set this down to listen to, yes, you worked hard, and your friend who's Black, who has the same qualifications as you and has a more Black sounding name on their resume, when before the hiring manager has even met either one of you, will advance your application that you worked hard for and not theirs. Yeah. And so there just it's the heavy burden of listening to understand. There needs to be listening, but there's very real cost in addition to the further just harm that is happening, and the trauma and the pain that others are feeling if you don't do this. There's very real practical bottom line reasons for businesses to get this right. That Brookings Institute, that Deloitte have come out with research that shows that companies that are more diverse and inclusive have higher retention, recruitment costs go down, and their bottom line revenue is up by 30%. Compared to their counterparts that don't have that. And so there's a cost to not doing anything. Awesome. And there are resources that are out there. And this conversation is happening now, which is why I love the title of this panel, which is Our New Normal. We have a new normal. How are we constructing that from the ground? Right now is the opportunity. There is some grace, I think, for people to get things wrong in this moment if they're working to get things right.
Got it.
But if you don't do that now, it's going to be harder.
Excellent. Excellent. Dr. Rafia, I know you've got tons to say. Let's hear it.
I mean, I think too, as I'm listening to Mr. Zimmerman and Dr. Robinson, this does start at the personal level, you know, and we have to really focus on what we can do individually to then influence our sphere of influence. And so as leaders, how are we creating an awareness for ourselves, but also what I also heard was how are we getting critical feedback? You know, as leaders, when you're making these decisions, who's within your inner circle, and have you allowed the space to for people to give you feedback, knowing that you're in a higher position? That's a skill that you need to have as a leader right now, particularly leading with humility, leading with vulnerability, having that courage to make mistakes, and then an opportunity to learn from it, to almost elevate that failure or the missed opportunity for learning to happen. These are just some thoughts that were
Absolutely. Now, I also heard you mention intersectionality, which we know is an important concept in this creating our new normal. Can you talk a little bit about what do you mean by intersectionality and how you see it as critical to creating this new normal?
Yeah, critical, intersectionality is really your identities. You only don't have one facet of an identity, but you have multiple. So as a person of color, I am Middle Eastern, but I might pass, and I do pass, as many other ethnicities. It's not only of how I perceive myself, but also how other people perceive me. And that's really important to understand, that you may have one reflection of yourself and you may think that you're one way, but others may perceive you very differently. So being really cognizant of that is really important. Other aspects like your age, your gender, how that may benefit you or how that may, harm in certain situations. Being the only female, understanding, but then also realizing that it's not, there are different levels of identity, but also understanding that there are barriers to that. There are, it's not necessarily a hierarchy of oppression, but it's different experiences and different lived experiences from your identities. How we need to really critically examine and how they show up in the workplace. So I may show up as a female person of color, but I may have reactions as a mother to something. And that's really important to understand, and how today, in today's world and what's been happening, it's touching on all these emotions and all of these identities in very complex ways. And we're not necessarily safe to show up in one way, but our visceral reaction is showing up in a very emotional tie that folks can't see, or it's not, you can't be in that space because that's not the dominant okay way to be in that.
Got it. Very good. Awesome. And please go ahead.
So if I could add to that, Dr. Jones, one of the things I think about when I grapple with the concept of intersectionality, I'm also grappling with how our intersectionality also creates this rotating privilege, right? And follow me here. So as a Black man, right, in both of those, in one area I have privilege, in another area I do not have privilege, right? And so I think it's important when we think about the rotation of our privilege is that we have the skill set to use our voices in areas where we are privileged and where we aren't privileged already, because it's a regular part of who we are, right? It's our intersectionalities, our personalities, right? And so I know that as a man, when I'm having a conversation about sexism, right, that I'm in a privileged position to be able to use my voice to maybe elevate someone who's not in that position. The same way that when that rotates to me being Black and maybe I'm speaking with one of my white colleagues who identifies as female, right, how her privilege as that individual then elevates her to use her voice in places where I do not have a voice, right? And so I think that as we think about intersectionality, we also can think about the rotating privilege that comes with all of our persons to create this inclusive environment, if that makes sense.
Excellent. It sure does. And let's continue the conversation about this new normal and go to the organization called Our Homes. Right? And so talk a little bit about it. I'm going to just open it up to whoever wants to start off. Talk a little bit about within our families, within our homes, with our children, with, the generations and our birth families as well as chosen families. What do you all see as some important components of building inclusion and anti-racism in the new normal of our family environments? Who wants to take it on first?
I'll go first.
Okay.
So I live, I moved back home. I live with my parents now, and I went from living with, myself, my wife, and my dog to living with 7 other people. But I think it's really important is to do the first part, which is to begin the conversation, right? And so we have daily conversations at the dinner table to begin to understand and unpack how everyone in the family is processing this information. And I know what's really important about family is that I know what my parents said, like, well, I raised you a certain way, I raised you to be a certain kind of person. So the assumption is then that we are aligned in terms of our thinking. Understanding that even at my dinner table, there are 3 different generations of people who are having conversations about this particular concept, right? And so without diving into the weeds, I think the first part is really to begin to have the conversation and also model what it looks like to listen to understand, what it looks like to be able to have a disagreement with someone and to agree to disagree, and what it looks like to be a learner, right? To be to ever be learning and knowing that as part of a family unit, not one person has to be the beholder of all things knowledgeable, all things wisdom. Because I can tell you, my 12-year-old sister teaches me things about her friend group that, and about inclusion, that blows my mind open, right? And so I would like to say, I think the first part of that is really opening up your family to getting used to having these conversations, because what happens, right, is that once you create this culture of having these conversations, then they take it outside of the home. It's the same way when we say, I use this analogy often, when we say, if you hear a 4th grader say something racist in the classroom, you would more than likely say they heard that at home. So we can shift that same narrative and say, if we hear or see a 4th grader being inclusive, more than likely they've seen that behavior modeled at home, right? And that begins with starting to have these conversations so there could be some dialogue. So
awesome. Thank you.
Well, I love this question because I'm sure I have some family watching and chuckling to themselves, because I'm the progressive black sheep of my family, but we're all really close. They're watching, you know, they're supportive, they're proud. And I will say that I used to get in big, huge blowouts with my parents. Love my parents to death. We get along extremely well. My brother, sister, and I, we're all really close. And they had different experiences growing up than I did. My dad, who really worked through a lot, became the man of the house when he was young, you know, really turned things around to give my brother, sister, and I an unbelievable childhood. And so the offense that someone would take when I'm saying that I know better than he does about, you know, like, now I'm a teacher in New York and you don't know about this and just even white privilege, we would get into arguments and we didn't listen to each other. What I realized is I wasn't listening to understand. I didn't listen to hear where you're coming from, how your values were cemented and how that makes sense. And that actually allowed the childhood that my brother, sister, and I had because of our parents, because of our aunts and uncles and grandparents who you know, provided that for us. And so once I started to listen, I also realized there's opportunities to share stories, because they're not in Harlem, they're not in the South Bronx working with the students who I worked with. They didn't hear their stories. And so how can I, instead of trying to say, you're incorrect, you're wrong, you know, I'm trying to persuade you, I'm not going to try to persuade you, but I am going to tell a story that perhaps challenges a narrative that you have, that, you know, living in East County, San Diego and Rancho San Diego, that you're not experiencing that. So I started to try to be more of a bridge in sharing those stories and having those conversations. And it's a two-way street. And so we have, you know, just very amazing conversations. And then also on the chosen family front, my fiance is from Mexico, has always lived in Mexico. And so there's very big cultural differences as well. And so just tapping into, you know, Mexico is not America. And so also listening and learning more here, if I'm going to engage in any, you know, these sorts of conversations, it's continuing to be that listening process.
Very good. Very good. Dr. Rafia?
Yeah, I have a small child, and I think that raising a son right now is difficult, because you don't want them to go through the process of unlearning. You want them to learn a new normal. You want them to learn a new shape so that they can be leaders and transform things. And so I'm making sure that, you know, I'm more aware, even more than I was, which is,
Mm-hmm.
you know, a lot now, but of the messaging that he gets. And
Yeah.
I can't help, it's everywhere. It's
Yeah.
in commercials, it's in the cartoons, it's in,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the music, or even, you know, talking amongst, you know, 5-6-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of binary, is it good, is it bad?
Yeah.
Is it black or is it white? Is it this or is it that? Is it boys or girls? Exclusionary language that's tossed around that folks just laugh at, you know, that parents are like, oh, well, this is, you know, they just want it to be a girl's thing, or this is just a boy's thing, and challenging that for him and having conversations about that. Also, you know, just noticing he's really into cars. So noticing, you know, about fast cars, and he's really into supercars, and you know, giving him an understanding of who that privilege is, economic privilege, in a very simplistic way.
Yeah.
You know, we were at the parking lot, and he was like, this is a very old car. And having that conversation about, you know, not just materialism, of course, but also recognizing who can afford that and who can't, and providing that frame and a different perspective for him is really important at a very young age. You know, children understand a lot more than I think we give them credit for.
That's right.
And we need to make sure that they are also, just to Andrew's point about who's within your circle, who's within your children's circle, and how are you exposing them to different things always, and giving them a different perspective. I know that last year in kindergarten, they did a Thanksgiving celebration, and I had this little reaction, like, are they telling the truth? Are they telling the real story? And so I got a book about, you know, the indigenous story of Thanksgiving. And I know at the time it might have been a little bit over his head, perhaps, but I think reinforcing those every year it comes up, and having those conversations is really important. You know, the other aspect of my identity, I'm Middle Eastern. There are times of my childhood that I didn't spend here, I spent in Iran, and knowing there are a lot of complexities when it comes to race and the color of your skin, how dark you are and how you're affected. And I know that just within our my circles of friends who are also Iranian, we have very vast differences in the way that we see race and racism in this, depending on our economic status, depending on, and just as Dr. Robinson said, our wheels of privilege, right? Depending on our identity, whether we're middle class or upper class, or where our neighborhoods were and what we were exposed to.
It's that lifelong process of learning, right? And I'll tell you, as we work in a lot of lower schools, we find that many of the white parents ask, how long should I wait before I talk with my kids about race and racism? And we find that many parents of color ask a different question, which sounds like, how soon do I need to have the conversation with my child? And Dr. Rafia, you bring up an important point around patterns of anti-Blackness that cut across different ethnic groups and deals with the level and the amount of melanin in our skins, and how we respond to that, both within group as well as across group, which connects to a question that we have from Jason Berkovich. I hope I pronounced that right, Jason, sorry. The question is, how would you recommend handling conversations on the hierarchy of oppression? And how can we stop what appears to be a competition over who is or has suffered the most? Who wants to respond to that question? And I'll ask one of you to respond, and then I'll go to a second question that we have. Or two short responses, your call.
So here's the way that I would say that. I think that as we're having a conversation about oppression, it goes back to Andrew's point earlier about listening to understand. Oftentimes when we're having conversations about topics that can be perceived as combative, or we have two different positions, the reality is that we create that energy, right? Where you're hanging on the edge of your seat to say, well, you know, as a Black man, this is what I experienced. Well, then as a woman, this is what I experienced. And what gets lost in the translation, right, is that we're all experiencing the very same points of oppression, just in a very different way. And so being able to have those conversations, part of what you can do is to model that behavior of listening to understand. It's sort of like when someone says to you, well, I don't like you. And your response is, okay, tell me more about that, right? Because then it changes the complete dynamic of the conversation, where now you've modeled this behavior of listening to understand, so you can sort of get to the bottom of it and have a more rich dialogue about what we can do together to make sure that none of us feel oppressed, regardless of what our oppression may look like in our personal lives.
Yeah, very good. Anyone else want to respond to that before I go to the second question?
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Robinson. I also think that, you know, we also need to examine power and privilege and how that plays out in whatever groups that we're talking about, because that's really at the heart of it. Oftentimes, you know, at institutions, they say, why are we talking about race? Why can't we talk about ableism? Why can't we talk about gender equality? And really it's if you look at where power lies and you look at the different privileges, then you're understanding more about why we need to be race salient, why we need to recognize race as central. And that's systemic. And so I think that understanding power and privilege is very key in understanding the hierarchy of oppression.
Got it.
Question, that was the terminology. Yeah.
Okay. Andrew, I want to ask this question from Rosa Maria Hernandez at Mana de San Diego. And she says, continuous long-term advocacy is necessary. It seems that nonprofits like Mana, Lead, and Rise are leading these difficult conversations. However, funding is something that is always challenging. Can you share how government agencies can ensure or change the dynamic around how we support the survival of advocates for the long term?
That's a great question, and definitely a challenge that you know, we need to try to figure out how to crack. And you know, I really think I lost my train of thought, but when it comes to funding, I really think that we need to look at the systems of oppression that are experienced in all different industries, right? Yeah. And funding and philanthropy is certainly one of them. And so at Rise San Diego, you know, that's been at the heart of Rise, is empowering leaders, mostly leaders of color, leaders who work in communities of color, across sectors. And so that we are able to have a city councilwoman who went through Rise San Diego and is powered to lead at the city level. We are able to have nonprofits that are being led by a diverse group of leaders equipped with adaptive leadership. And we're able to have funders who go into those sorts of positions. Same with government, same with service on boards. And so for me, I think more just systemically on that larger level, it's generating that network of leadership. And Mana is certainly doing that and empowering that. But, you know, I know that you're also speaking to the lack of that funding, and we've all, you know, sort of experienced that. So I think it's paying attention on how we build that network intentionally. Because again, you know, like, it's a question about how do we diversify our boards? Well, you know, if it's all older white men, they're friends with older white men, they think that older white man is going to be good for the board, rather than a young Black woman who you know, like, doesn't sound like them, doesn't talk like them, and makes them feel a little uncomfortable because they're different than them. They want to preserve. And so it's who's in our friend group. And so we do need to build that collective map.
Yeah. I think that, excuse me, I think that's so powerful. I think about oftentimes when funding is in place, many organizations will look to the larger nonprofits, you know, to fund the more quote unquote established nonprofits. and not look for those established nonprofits that are in the community and of the community, who understand the community and have a relationship with the community, that then when those resources are distributed, they are trusted when they are received, right? Versus nonprofits that get the funding and then have to build a relationship with the community, or hire people to do the work who are from the community, but don't have those same people in leaderships, in positions of leadership, right, to move that work forward. So I think it's just a really important point to say, again, go back to power, right? What are the power dynamics within the nonprofits and the levels of diversity and equity within the organization itself. So we've got 4 minutes left. Let's go to, we're building this new normal. What is 1 to 2 things you want to say to our audience to say, and let's do it this way. 1 thing you want our audience to do, and 1 thing you want our audience to avoid when they're building this new normal. Now, that is not a question we practiced, so I want to give you a second. I don't think you need the practice, but 1 thing you want to see people do, 1 thing you want to see people avoid. We'll open it up.
You know, thinking about our conversation here and what has been discussed, you know, I think one of the things to do is to really have the courage. You know, I think that it's having the courage to lead, to be in those conversations, to be okay in the discomfort, to allow others to give you feedback, for you to listen to it, for you to receive it, and to critically reflect on it. A lot of the things that we talked about today starts with the self, and you know, just self-reflecting and thinking about actionable steps, because people feel overwhelmed and they're like, well, what do I do? It's really looking at what's within your sphere of influence and control, and starting from there.
Very good. Excellent. Thank you. Andrew.
I think, so go with me here. What I want you to do is I want you to find your entry point. Where can you start to engage in this conversation? Many folks are going to be at the kindergarten level, where you hear white privilege and that scares you, and you want to be defensive. Well, that's going to be like you're starting out, but find that entry point. Maybe you're a little further along and you should read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander and start to get into you know, the prison pipeline structures. And so find your entry point and continue to engage, because it's a journey, and you're going to continue to grow and be challenged at the right level. Because, you know, if you start talking about intersectionality too soon, then maybe you're going to opt out of the conversation and walk away. But engage where you feel challenged, where you feel discomfort, but keep progressing, and you can do that. And to avoid, I would just say, you know, if you are someone who listens to defend, listens to argue, listens to debate, if you're not really listening, if you're listening to defend your worldview, if you're listening to confirm the biases that you have, ask yourself, are you listening to understand? When there are protests happening with the Black Lives Matter movement right now, that's okay to disagree with rioting, property destruction, but are you listening to what the protesters are saying? Do you know the leaders who are the protesters and what they're saying, and just trying to hear, you know, what their perspective is? Like Dr. Robinson said, you know, if they say, I don't like you, how are you responding to that? Can you say, okay, can you tell me more? And getting to that point.
So thank you. Thank you. Dr. Robinson.
And lastly, I would say, I think we need to have these conversations regularly and not make them as part of a training that we went to, or sort of this conversation that I have with my friend who I feel safe with. And as Dr. Rafia was speaking earlier, what it made me think about as she was speaking about, her son, was that people oftentimes will pick up more from conversations they hear you having when you're not present. So how are people hearing you talk about inclusion, diversity, equity, systemic racism when they don't know you are present, right? And the only way for people to hear you having those conversations is for you to have those conversations, right? So that's the first tip that I would say. In terms of avoid trying to be an ally or create change the exact way that someone else is doing it, right? Avoid trying to mimic that behavior. You have to do it in your own way, whatever you feel comfortable with, right? Because the work is difficult, right? And there's going to be some pressure, there's going to be some discomfort, right? So it's important for you to be able to find your way of doing it, so that way when it gets uncomfortable, you at least know that you're confident in the reason you're doing it and the way that you're doing it. And then to Andrew's point, being open to adjust that. You don't have to find an absolute way to do it. You may decide to send an email today, and you may decide to say something to somebody's face tomorrow, and that is perfectly okay. And so just avoid trying to do it one particular way. Find what works for you.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you all very, very much for this powerful, informative conversation and dialogue with each other. I appreciate the gems of tangible action, insights, and frameworks that you all have shared with us. I want to close this out by saying, to your point, while this work can be very challenging and uncomfortable, it can also be very inspiring, and very much so about growth as well. And so lean in. Right, lean in, have that conversation, and I think our panelists have laid it all before us. So thank you all very, very much. Really appreciate it. Dr. Rafia, Mr. Zimmerman, and Dr. Robinson, really want to thank you for your time. And for everyone who joined us, thank you very much, whether you're on ABC 10 News live streaming or on this webinar directly through Lead San Diego. We really appreciate you being in. The webinar will be available and has been recorded. And so you'll be able to have access to view it. Go to Lead San Diego's LinkedIn page or Facebook page or social media or website, and you'll be able to get access to the webinar and to send it to people you would like to see view it as well. We are excited to bring you Leading in the New Reality. Thank you very much. Take care, everyone, and be safe.